This past week is one that brought yet another episode of frightening news to the world, that news of the terrorist attack in Belgium. I was reflecting on my own digestion of these reports and realized something even more frightening than the terrible carnage which was wrought. And that is that I was no longer shocked. I almost received that news with, well, I knew that was probably coming sometime. We have become desensitized to the evil of our world and the great harm that is done by some folks to other folks with regularity and with callousness all around the globe and for all different kinds of reasons. Human society is tragically broken. In the midst of this grim reality, however, we gather in a place like this on Easter Sunday to hear the good news. God has a plan to set the world right. And moreover, God has given us an important role to play. That is, to tell, to declare the good news of what God has done and what God will do. You heard me correctly. You and I have an important role to play in what God is doing in the world. Really, you might say, what can we do? We are but a few hundred people. We live in a place called Barrie or its surrounding area, a place which they've scarcely heard of in other parts of the world. The claim that God is doing something in our world is hard enough to believe. The claim that we have some important role to play in God's plan, well, you might even think it's laughable. You might even think it's embarrassing for me to stand here and to say it. Well, friends, embarrassment is nothing new for Christians. We are like teenagers who are seen with their parents at the mall, embarrassed afresh in every generation. Laurie read so well for us one of the Easter accounts that we find in the New Testament Gospels. We learn at first light, on the first day of the week, at their first opportunity after the close of the Sabbath day of rest, that some of the women who were friends and followers of Jesus went to anoint or embalm his body for a longer-term burial. You see, just prior to the onset of the Sabbath on Friday evening, Jesus had been buried in rather a hasty way. And the women went to the tomb at first light on Sunday to give him a proper burial. They arrived, as we know, to find that the stone had been rolled away from the mouth of the tomb and that Jesus was not inside. They heard the report of the angels what had happened. And on their way home, they were encountered by the risen Christ. With both fear and great joy, they went to tell the other followers of Jesus. And how then did those other followers of Jesus receive the reports of the women? They dismissed them out of hand. For as the gospel writer tells us, their words were as idle nonsense. Why would the followers of Jesus respond in this way? Had not their Lord anticipated ahead of time what was to happen? Had not Jesus given them forewarning? Well, in fact, they dismissed the reports of the women simply because they were women. It may seem hard to believe in our time, but in the first century, in the Jewish culture of Palestine, a woman's word counted for nothing. A woman's testimony bore no weight. And yet in the earliest days following the first Easter, the story continued to be told and retold in just that way, including just that detail, which certainly would have been on some level a great embarrassment to the earliest followers of Jesus. Here they have this wonderful, world-changing news, and yet it was first witnessed and first reported by a series of witnesses who were ruled out ahead of time as unreliable in that culture. And so we wonder why they persisted in the days and weeks and even years to follow, telling the story in that way. And we can come then to only one likely conclusion. That is that they told the story that way because that's how it happened. And it was too important a story to change even a single detail. I remember hearing one time the story of a well-known Christian writer, the author of a series of best-selling books. And he tells of how before he came to faith in Jesus, he was an unpleasant person. He was bitter, he was angry, he was short. People didn't like to be around him. He did not demonstrate grace or love in any way. He was self-centered and harsh. When his faith came alive, there became a remarkable transformation. He was softened. He became gracious and loving, and someone whom others wanted to be around. But even the weight and the significance of that transformation didn't hit home for him until he heard from his little girl's Sunday school teacher that his daughter had said to this teacher, "I want Jesus to do for me what he did for my daddy." The Apostle Paul says something like this in his first letter to the Corinthians. Not exactly in these words, it's my paraphrase, my version, but this is what he said. Sometimes God uses the weak and the unknowing to tell the strong and the wise about the mighty acts of God. In the days and the weeks and the years following that first Easter, the earliest Christians continued to pass on the story of Jesus' resurrection by word of mouth. It was a period of oral transmission. And as I've already mentioned, the method and the content of that message was likely an embarrassment to those folks. Well, in the years and decades that followed, those first witnesses to the resurrection grew older and began to pass on. And so within the early Christian movement, they started to write down these stories which hence had been told. And these different written accounts were compiled together and shaped into the documents we now know as the New Testament Gospels. And perhaps you might think they would have taken this opportunity to edit and to reshape the stories in a way which would have reflected better on them. But in fact, that is not what they did. The disciples of Jesus, for example, those who had followed him around throughout his public ministry or campaign, became in large measure the leaders of the burgeoning Christian movement following Easter. And yet in these written accounts that preserved their own eyewitness testimony, they described themselves in very unflattering ways. Throughout the public activity of Jesus, for example, we find his followers not understanding what he is teaching, and we find them not believing in a significant enough way what he was saying about himself. And here they are in the accounts of the first Easter, not believing what has been told them by their fellow followers. And in fact, about which Jesus had forewarned them. And so the Gospels preserve for us a very unflattering picture of the disciples. Some of you may have been, as I was, a fan of The Simpsons. And if you've ever seen The Simpsons, you know that Homer Simpson is one of the greatest fools in the history of our culture. And in one brilliant episode, Reverend Lovejoy asks Homer Simpson to volunteer at the local church. And Homer responds, "But I don't even believe in Jeebus." We can almost imagine these same words on the lips of the disciples. Not believing, not knowing, not understanding. And yet somehow they became the driving force of a movement of which we are still adherents today. A movement which has gathered us here in this time and in this place. Some of you have likely heard the story of Charles Colson. Colson was a lawyer by training who went in the late 1960s to work in the administration of U.S. President Richard Nixon. And likely you remember from the history books that Richard Nixon was a very corrupt president. He later was forced to leave office for the illegal activities that occurred under his watch and even under his direction. Well, within the administration of Richard Nixon, Charles Colson was known as the Hatchet Man. He was the one who made sure that whatever had to get done got done. Colson was one of those involved in the Watergate scandal, the break-in and some of the other illegal activities that went on. While he was being investigated for various criminal charges, Charles Colson was presented with the message of Jesus' saving work and became a Christian. where he had previously been obstructing the prosecution of his charges, he decided from then on it was his duty to admit responsibility for what he had done and plead guilty. He pled guilty and in 1974 served a prison sentence. Following his release from prison, he founded an organization called the Prison Fellowship, which since that time and to this very day has ministered to tens of thousands of inmates, sharing with them the good news of God's love, which is for every single one of them, no matter what they have done. And in the decades leading up to his death in 2012, Colson became a very articulate and prominent proponent of the Christian faith. A remarkable transformation for someone who had once been Richard Nixon's hatchet man. Sometimes, you see, friends, unexpected and significant transformation is possible. As the Christians in the earliest days and weeks and years and even decades of the movement persisted in telling a story which both in form and content was embarrassing to them, so does there remain that element of embarrassment for us who are followers of Jesus to this day. The well-known atheist Richard Dawkins once said to a large crowd in Washington, D.C., "Find some believers, mock them, and ridicule them." There is a well-known journalist who appears on the national news for CBC. And some time ago, I heard him refer to Christian beliefs in a very condescending tone as being utterly ridiculous. It's always good to see my tax dollars at work. Our culture thinks we ought to be embarrassed. And perhaps we ought to be. I'll always remember the first day I was old enough to walk home from school on my own. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I was no older than being in grade 4. From grade 5 on, I went to a different school, and I distinctly remember that the first day I walked home from school on my own, it was at the school that I attended up until grade 4. Now, this was a big moment in my life. And I remember that on that afternoon when school let out, my mom actually came, as she had always done previously, but rather than walk with me, she hung back at a distance. And I was a little embarrassed by this. And not long after my friends and I had left the school property, we came to a corner, and my friends cut across the lawn that was sitting on the property at this one corner. And so I too cut across the lawn. And my mom ran over and grabbed me and took me back and then walked me around on the sidewalk. That was a very embarrassing moment for me, and I expect on some level it was an embarrassing moment for her. Sometimes it's okay to be embarrassed. Sometimes there is teaching and learning in embarrassment. God can use the weak and the unknowing to tell the strong and the wise about the mighty acts of God. Unexpected and significant transformation is possible. Sometimes our embarrassment, our willingness to be embarrassed for the good news, can be the very tool by which God works in the world. And you might say, is that really true? Or is this just something more about which to be embarrassed? Yes. Thanks be to God.